Many years ago, in the middle of the 20th century, America asked a young man to go to war. It was the time of the Second World War. The United States was engaged in World War II from December 7th, 1941 until August of 1945. It was a conflict which left few places on earth untouched. It was fought on all the oceans, in all the skies, on tropical islands, and in ancient cities. When that young man went off to war, he left his home, his family, his school, his job. He didn't know it at the time, perhaps, but this ordinary, everyday American, and millions like him, were being asked to save the world. He and thousands of other Marines and soldiers fought their way across the Pacific, storming ashore on islands held by a ferocious enemy. They created legends, and whether he was on the front line or the supply line, that young Marine contributed his part to those legends. I believe we owe that Marine, your family's World War II veteran, an enormous debt of gratitude. We should never forget his courage, his sense of duty, his sacrifice. His contributions made possible the freedoms and life we all too often take for granted. I was a correspondent during that war. Despite all that's happened since then, nothing has made a bigger impression on me than the willingness of those young American soldiers to go beyond the call to duty. Because of their determination, America itself was changed, and the world as we know it today was born. I consider it a great honor to introduce the story your veteran will tell of his contribution to America's role in World War II. It's his story, told by him in his words, and it's a part of American history. Listen to this story and remember it. He's dedicating it to you, his family, and to all his descendants. This is the best part of our nation's heritage. It's real. It's the story of one veteran, one of those everyday heroes who saved the world. Honor him as I do.
I was born in Owasso, Michigan, December 6, 1921. We moved out near Oakley on a farm when I was 6 years old. I attended one-room grade school and graduated from the 8th grade in 1933. Didn't go to high school. Times were hard, and I had to stay home and work on the farm with my dad and mother and brothers. In 1939, I had to go to work on a farm for a man over by Chesaning by the name of Hank Thickeyes, $25 a month in my room and board. And my brother had worked in Saginaw Melville Iron, and in early 1940, he got me a job down there. And I worked at Saginaw Melville Iron Foundry, poured iron tap out on the furnaces. And then December 7th, 1941, when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, I decided that I would go into the Marine Corps. But I had some financial obligations that I'd had to take care of. But on September 2nd, 1942, I left for the Marine Corps from Bay City, Michigan, got into the bus to Detroit, and I had never been away very much. We got in, there was about 40 of us, and to be sworn in, and the corporal who was typing us up in a typewriter was asking all his questions and the information and typing it in the typewriter, and he pushed the papers over to me and asked me what my full name was, and I told him Clay Woodrow Reeves. I'd never written my full name in my life, but he says, sign your full name, and I signed Clay W. Reeves. And he looked and swore at me and typed some more papers. And he says, now sign your full name, Clay Woodrow Reeves, and I signed on the wrong line. And he swore at me some more, and he says, son, you won't last 2 weeks in this outfit. They'll send you home. Went in and had my physical and done some other things. And after about 45 minutes or an hour, we had to stand in rank, all 40 of us, and an old retired colonel had come out of retirement, inspected us and looked us over head to toe and went down in front of us and then behind us. And he came behind me and we stood at parade rest. I had my hands folded behind me. And he see my hands, and he said, "What kind of work do you do, son?" And I said, "I poured iron in the foundry." And he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "You'll make a good one." And I was so relieved. I went from the bottom to the top in just a short time. We stayed overnight in Detroit, took a train to Chicago the next day, picked another train up and went to San Diego. Was in boot camp in San Diego for the 60 days. And then sometime in late November, December, we went out to a place called Camp Linda Vista, a tent camp, and we formed the 2nd Anti-Tank Battalion. And we were there, trained for a couple of days, and I got stationed on the half-track with a 75 millimeter gun on it. And in February 1943, we went aboard the troop ship Mormicport and went overseas, sailed for New Zealand. 36 days aboard ship, docked at Wellington, New Zealand, and unloaded our own ship, and then went out to a camp called Paikakarica. It was near Wellington, probably about 40 miles, where the 2nd Marine Division had been, and we stayed there for some time. We went overseas to New Zealand because the Japanese were headed in that direction, and they'd conquered all the islands north of there. And but something happened. In August 1942, a 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, and they fought there for several months and finally conquered it, and that stopped the southern thrust of the Japanese army. And so there was no concern about the Japs invading New Zealand or Australia. And the tank unit was of no use in the jungle, so they broke us up and sent us back to the States. And we formed the 5th Marine Division at Camp Elliott, California, in 1944. And we were there for some time. Meanwhile, I had made corporal. And while we were in Camp Elliott playing volleyball, I fell and hurt my wrist. I thought I just sprained it. And word came we were going overseas. So we went overseas and went to the big island of Hawaii and stayed there on the large ranch. While we were there, I had made buck sergeant. So now it's late 1944, and we'd go out into the field to dig gun emplacements with our 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, and my wrist would hurt. And I told Corpsman Gallardi, and he said, "We'll have it x-rayed and see what's happened." And there was a bone broken, and my left wrist, they placed a cast on it, and I stayed on duty. It was the cast on for 6 weeks, and then they removed the cast and x-rayed again, and it was still broken, and put on a new cast. Meanwhile, Platoon Sergeant Haught got promoted, and they transferred him, and they promoted me to acting platoon sergeant. I didn't get the rank, but I got the job. And word came that we were going to combat. And Captain Glassman called me down to his office, which was a tent. And he said, "Reeves, your arm's in a cast, and we're going into combat, and we're going to leave you behind." And I said, "Captain Glassman, I've been in the Marine Corps now almost 3 years. And I've been overseas twice. And I still haven't seen combat. And I want to go." And I said, "We'll be aboard ship for probably 3 or 4 weeks. And the day before we go to land, I'll go to sick bay aboard ship and have it x-rayed. And if it's okay, why, I'll go ashore. If not, you determine what to do." So he said, "Okay." We boarded ship and made several maneuvers and then headed for Iwo Jima. We didn't know that's where we were going. We met the rest of the convoy at Kwajalein and then headed out for Iwo Jima. February 18th, I had Corpsman Gallardi cut the cast off my arm, and he gave me a paper to go to sick bay aboard ship. I got to the sick bay and give him the papers, said x-ray this man's arm, and I had him x-ray my right arm instead of my left. It showed no fracture, and they gave me a paper, cleared me to go ashore. The next morning, 5 o'clock, we were up and were given steak sandwiches. And 7 o'clock, we went over the side of the ship, down the cargo nets and into the landing craft, and then got into position to go ashore. About 7 o'clock, the Navy ships began to shell the island from all directions, and the big battleships and the cruisers and everything else. About 8:30, they stopped, and the Navy and Marine Corps planes from carriers came and strafed and bombed the island, and we're just circling around out there waiting to go in. 9 o'clock, the first wave hit the beach. And the second wave, we were to go in about 11 o'clock, and things didn't go very good. And we never got ashore until about 4 that afternoon. We hit the beach and jumped out of the landing craft and landed right on the beach. And we went up the steep embankment where the volcanic ash was so loose that very hard to go through it. We had to get off the beach real quick, and so we moved forward into the island, found the place we were supposed to be, and we were in reserve. And we moved in midway in the island and dug in. You didn't have to dig a hole, there was all kind of shell holes. And we waited till dark, got our rations and water for the next day, and got the men all settled in. And after it got dark, we set up our night watch. And it was about midnight before I got a chance to go to sleep. And I knelt down in the foxhole and shell hole, really. Every night I'd always said a prayer. And I'd pray for my mother and father and brothers back home and their wives. And I had 2 brothers that was in the Army. Both were married, both had children. And I'd pray a prayer, bless Mom and Dad and Ken and Fred and their families, and Chum and Tough in the Army. And if one of us boys needs to give his life, may it be me. Now, I said that prayer from the time I went in the Marine Corps. But here now, I'm in combat. Shells are exploding. Many men have been killed. And I knelt to say that prayer. And when I got to the place of saying, may it be me, I stopped. And I thought, any minute I might be killed. I don't know how long I paused, but I think just a few moments. And finally I said, may it be me. And there never has been a more wonderful peace come over me than at that time. I knew that, and God knew that I meant it. And I lay down and went to sleep. That night we lost a mortar round, landed in a hole and killed 4 of our men, both the armors, sergeant, corporal. And second day, still in reserve, and weren't moving very far. Stayed put in the holes because you didn't dare expose yourself. And our lieutenant, platoon leader, was Lieutenant Skelton. And he came over and he said they were relieving him and placing him in the rifle company because many of the officers had been killed, wounded. So now, and I was to take over the platoon. And now I was not only acting platoon sergeant, but acting platoon leader. So we went the third day, we moved up. We were no longer in reserve. Moved up the front lines of action. And not too much happened. Each day we'd lose a couple of men. You couldn't see the enemy. They were in caves. Didn't advance very far. A couple 100 yards, and that would be it. We had a lot of casualties. You'd dig in and wait. The 4th day, 10 o'clock in the morning, we see the flag go up on Suribachi. And all the ships offshore, bells were ringing, horns were blowing, made a terrible racket. And very grateful to see that happen. But then the battle was still going on ahead. And the fifth day, it had rained that night, and it was foggy, very foggy in the morning. And Captain Glasson called me in the morning sometime before daybreak, said that the Japanese had counterattacked through the night and broke through the front lines, and that he wanted me to take my platoon up and plug the hole. So I got my men ready, and we ready to go, and I see some Marines straggling back from the front, and I recognized one of them, Gunny Heacock, who had been on Guadalcanal, and who was a man that I would follow anywhere. And I ran over to him and I said to him, Gunny, how's it going up there? And he never looked up, never stopped. He just says, it's hell up there. So I took my men, went about 100, 150 yards to where I thought we were close to the front lines, and I left them and went alone to try to find the right or left flank. And I walked probably another 100 yards. I had my carbine, radio, field glasses, of course my pack, and I came to a huge rock about the size of an automobile. The fog was beginning to lift a bit, and I thought, well, I'd stop by this rock and call on the radio and see where I was at. I laid my elbow on the rock. It was almost as high as I was. Put the radio to my face to talk, and I heard a zap, and a bullet went through my sleeve, made 4 holes in my left sleeve, as I had my arm raised up to my face and hit the rock. And so I swung around there and run back to where we came from. Started over, went back up and found the right flank, tied in, and we were on the front lines again. We were there for several days. We advanced now. We were somewhere beyond up where the second airfield was, and back on the front, and we were being shelled by the Japs from the cave, and I got shrapnel in my left arm from a mortar round, and I was treated by Cormac Gilardi and stayed on duty. We stayed on the front for a few days and then were sent back for some rest and reorganize. And we sent back to the area we were going and to stay for one night. And as I was tying the telephone in, we was right near to a cave where it had been blasted shut and flamethrower. And I looked up and there was 2 Japanese crawling out of this hole. And they had surrender leaflets. And they were waving them, and they were dirty, their clothes were torn, but they had big smiles on their face. They were surrendering with these surrender leaflets. And I took them, and we had learned a little bit of Japanese so we could speak, and assured them that they wouldn't be hurt. And I took the papers and sent a couple of men back to the rear echelon to the prisoners. Next day, back up front again, and as we had come to this ridge, it was terribly hard. We weren't making any progress. And the artillery began to shell and a rolling barrage. And one round was too close, and I got some shrapnel in my left leg, nothing serious, and treated for that, stayed on duty. So we moved up, and again, we were running short of men. Casualties were running high, and it was just terribly hard going. So we come to near the end of the island, and the 18th of February, and Captain Glasson said that the second lieutenant would take over the platoon and that he would be in charge. And so he introduced himself, and I don't remember who he was. I'd never seen him before. And I asked him what our job was to do that day, and he said we were in reserve, and if they needed us, they'd call us. So all day long we stayed put in our shell holes, and about 5, 6 o'clock that night, the front lines had advanced probably 100, 150 yards. And there was only an area about 200 yards wide, 800 yards deep, where the enemy was yet. The 4th Division had secured their area and they were going aboard ship and leaving, and the 3rd Division had secured their area and they were leaving. The 5th Division had just a small area, 200 yards wide and 800 deep. Caves on both sides and terribly rocky. Tanks couldn't get up in there. And so, long about dark, he says, we're to move up and behind the front line and dig in. So we moved up and this place to where we had to dig in and pile rocks around you is all you could do. And I told the men, I said, look the area over real close and be sure there's no booby traps or spider traps. And so off to my right, about 40 feet, Private DeRiggy said, hey, Sarge, there's a Jap in the hole here, but I think he's dead. And I yelled, well, shoot him anyway, be sure. And he tried to shoot his rifle and it jammed. He screamed and hollered, he's alive. Private Adams ran over there then to help. And as he approached the hole, DeRiggy trying to get his rifle was afire. The Jap set off a charge. He was sitting on a case of dynamite or TNT and blew himself up. Blew a hole in the ground that you put a Jeep in. Blew DeRiggy and Adams a good 40 feet to the rear, and they landed DeRiggy in his bag on the rocks and couldn't move. His face and hands were bleeding, shredded. Adams was on his hands and knees. His hands were shredded, he couldn't see. And I yelled, Corman, Corman. This is getting dark. Rocks were falling and dirt and dust. And finally, Gallardi come over, our corpsman, and I asked him where he had been. And he said, Sergeant Ring got hit in the back with a rock and knocked the wind out of him. I was working on him. So he did what he could for DeRiggy and Adams and got them on stretchers and sent them back. I've never seen them till this day. I went to the lieutenant and I said, Lieutenant, what are we supposed to be doing today? And he says, we're supposed to be mopping up behind the front lines. And I got on the telephone and I called Captain Glassman. And I said, Captain Glassman, I told him what had happened. I said, I don't care what you do to me, but I refuse to move my men anymore for this guy. And I hung up. The next morning, 6 o'clock, phone rang. Captain Glassman said, Reeves, Colonel Pollock wants to see you. And that was it. So I went back to regimental headquarters, and Captain Pollock, or Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, come out and he said, Reeves, we're short-handed, the men are tired, they're worn out, we have no officers, we have no organization, we're going to go slow. We're going to bring up 2 armored bulldozers to make roads in this area, and you're to guide them, make these roads. They have a phone on the back of the bulldozers. You're to be sure no Japs come out with satchel charges, and then we're going to bring out flame-throwing tanks, and then we'll advance. So all day long, I directed those bulldozers. About 4 o'clock, they withdrew. The 2 flame-throwing tanks came up and began to spray right and left. I advanced with them, and the front line advanced with them. We came to a ridge about 20 feet high all the way across the ravine. We broke over the top of that, and the Japs were all dug in little holes all across that ridge. And we caught them by surprise and shot them from 8-10 feet away. In just a few seconds, the battle was over. And the Marines throwed the Japs out of the holes and got in themselves and dug in. I come down off that ridge, and I was higher than a kite. Walked over to the command post where was running the operation and said, what do I do next? And before he could answer, I was shot through the right leg, knocked me down. I rolled over on my back and wiggled my toes, and I didn't think anything was broken. Began to crawl, dragging my leg, and I heard a zap right in front of my face, and the dust kicked up, and he was still shooting at me. And I got up and ran back from where we started, and I was done. I walked back, which would be 5 miles, back to Airfield 1 Field Hospital, got there about dark, was treated, and the next morning, cargo plane came and unloaded and was going back to Guam, and Colonel Pollock had got shot that afternoon in the shoulder. And he and I both got on the plane and rode out of Iwo to Guam. Was at Guam for about a week. Got a hospital shipped to Pearl Harbor. Was there for a couple of weeks, and my health records caught up with me at the hospital. And the doctor called me into his office and said, "Reeves, your hospital health records came, and it shows you have a fractured wrist, and doesn't say that it's been healed. I'm going to send you down to sick bay and have x-rays." So I went down, had an x-rayed, and brought him back, and he said, "The wrist is still fractured. I'm going to put a cast on your arm and send you home." And I told him, I said, I'd had 2 casts already, and I had been promised as I stopped back after I'd got shot, stopped by and seen Captain Glassman, and he said that I'd done a good job, and that he was going to put me up for a field commission when we got back to Hawaii. And I told the doctor that, and I said, "I want to get back to my unit and get that field commission." He says, "You're going home." I'm the doctor. So my arm was placed in a cast. I went back to the ward, and next day got a plane to Oakland, California. There in the hospital for a week, and then went to Great Lakes. From there, I had a furlough of 30 days, and then 30 days sick leave. And when I got home, I didn't have a girlfriend when I was in the service, or before I went in. And I met a girl that I saw was just the most prettiest thing I ever saw. And I just was determined she was going to be my wife. I was home then till the war ended. They dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war ended. And I was home on furlough. And the day it ended, that night, people all come to town, stores were closed. People who could play instruments, horn, bugles, whatever, marched up and down the streets for hours, late into the night, shouting, celebrating, singing, "The war is over." I went back then to Great Lakes Hospital, was transferred to Cherry Point, North Carolina, and October 2nd, 1945, I was discharged. I came home, found my girlfriend in June 1946, June 8th. We were married, and 1947, we had our first child, daughter Barbara, and I never went back to the foundry. I'm not really sure why, but I got in on the GI Bill and learned to be an auto mechanic, and went to school on that and worked on a GI Bill, and that's pretty much what I've done all my life. I started in 1948, started the business on my own, Reeves Wheel Alignment, and I have 2 boys working with me, Glenn and Jeff, and they're part owners, along with their mother, and I'm pretty well retired now, and I go in and work a few hours a day, but not too much. And in dedication to this, my story, and this video, I'd like to dedicate it to my wife, Faye. We've been married 54 years now, and our children, particularly Barb and Clay and Jeff, Eric and Glenn, and to my grandchildren that belong to Jeff and Glenn, and to those who we adopted, particularly Larry, who has been just like one of our own. And it's been a great joy and a great pleasure to have this family and to dedicate this to them. And this I would like to do. I would like to say in closing that I've been very fortunate to come home, and I love my God, I love my country, and I love my family. Thank you.